This is episode 39 of a series called A Complete History of Lincoln. We want to thank Speedway Properties as they have paid for the complete funding of the taping of these programs for over 10 years now. Jim McKee, it's all yours.
Thank you, and thank you, John, also for saying that I am not the penultimate authority, although Ed Zimmer would probably agree with that assessment, and he'd probably be right. It's strange, perhaps, that our first slide at the Preservation Association of Lincoln should start with a picture of Omaha, but much of the State Fair's history does not start in Lincoln, it starts in Omaha. This is the Union Pacific headquarters building, or the Herndon House Hotel, and it is here that the story of the State Fair actually starts. There it is, hidden in plain sight. It was in 1858, in October, that a group will meet in this building in Omaha, and they will begin planning along with Governor Furness. This is actually Governor Mortis, J. Sterling Morton, but they will begin planning at that point a territorial fair, because before Nebraska was a state, it was a territory. And the territorial fair which they will begin planning will be not only the first territorial fair for Nebraska, it will be the only territorial fair for Nebraska, and it will interestingly be the only territorial fair ever in the United States of any territory. So we had the only one. Planning began October the 14th of 1858, and the Board of Agriculture, which was at that time headed by Mr. Morton, approved it. They met then at the Herndon House Hotel and decided to host a fair for the territory at whatever city afforded the largest donation and the best accommodations. So it was kind of up for grabs, and whoever wanted to make the bid. The purpose of the fair would be to encourage, develop farming in Nebraska, stimulate honest rivalry, and it was one of the best evidences and promoters of prosperity. That's what they said. So the first fair is going to be not in Lincoln, turns out, not in Omaha either. It will be in Nebraska City, held the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of 1859 at the Fairgrounds and Driving Park in Nebraska City. We don't have many photographs of that fair. We do have this one, which interestingly enough shows the guy in the front with the hat is J. Sterling Morton, most probably. At the point in time the fair was held, even though he has a complete beard in the picture, he was 26 years old. And he is going to deliver from the back of a wagon at the Territorial Fair a complete history of the state of Nebraska. Of course, it is that point in time only 5 years old, not even that. And one wonders how much he had to say, but not too much. There were prizes awarded at the fair. The total value of all the prizes given was $35. However, it included a gold watch, a saddle, a bridle, 2 sets of jewelry, and a goodly number of diplomas, almost all of which were won by one man, J. Sterling Morton. The fair lost money. However, they considered it a great success. The board disbanded, and we saw a map of the fairgrounds at that point in time. And some of these slides will not be current with what I'm talking about, so I'll continue talking about the last one, but you will be seeing other things. The important value or factors in early fairs were that the railroads would be very necessary. Local businessmen also agreed to transport agricultural exhibits and sometimes livestock, sometimes free, sometimes at a great discount all over the state. They also offered special fares to passengers of $5 for anywhere in the state of Nebraska, after the railroads got here, of course. The attendance at the first fair was 2,924. Henry Brandt would have probably said that at about 10 o'clock in the morning of the first fair. Henry managed to set a record every hour the fair was opened every year, whether it was good or not. The first state fair at Nebraska City actually showed a profit of $73. Then it moved from there in 1870 to Brownville. It was there in 1870 and 1871. The first fair in Lincoln was actually a county fair, and that was a county fair in October of 1870. We think this is the Territorial Fair, but we're not absolutely positively sure. This is a map of Brownville and the fairgrounds. In the early fairs, which we saw, we had very sort of liberal terms surrounding gambling. Pools were legal, for example, on horse races, and the rights to operate these pools were sold as a concession. You can see today this would probably bring about some interesting political rivalry between candidates. In 1876, the guy that was licensed to sell the pools was a man named Mr. Wilkerson, and he immediately skipped town with between $500 and $1,000. They're not sure which, but they got hold of him in Falls City. Unfortunately, he escaped to Kansas, and we never did get him again, so we don't know what happened for sure. The concessions, however, at these early fairs provided about 13% of the revenue of the fairs. In 1879, there was a legislative act, and of course we're now at state instead of territorial fairs. There was to be no selling of intoxicants, no indecent shows or dances, no gambling, no games of chance, no horse racing at any fair in the state or county or district within 40 rods of the enclosure of the fairgrounds. This is probably the first fair building in Lincoln, but it would have been originally constructed for the county. Here we can see, if you use your imagination, we can actually see where the fairgrounds was located, because the railroad would be to our right, and that road which paralleled the railroad, of course, is still there. And that first building, which we saw a picture of a minute ago, was off over in the middle of what's now the Innovation Campus, actually probably the east edge of the Innovation Campus. By 1881, the fair is being held in Omaha. It was held in 81, 82, 83, and 84 in Omaha at the driving park, which was land owned by Mr. Kuntz. Then in 1883, the legislature changed the rules and said they would give the authority to put the fair at any location in the state of Nebraska for 5 years, no more. That was the maximum that they would allow it to go to any place. This is a picnic probably in the 1890s, something like that, 1895. But we remember it was there through 1884. 1885, it was held in Lincoln. And although I may have said this picnic was in Omaha, we don't know for sure. There's some guess that it probably was in Lincoln. Everybody bought their own lunch at that point in time. In 1894, the fair was again held in Omaha. It was unsuccessful, lost money, and the board of directors of what was amounted to the state fair at that time set down an edict and said that the state fair in Omaha needed to provide entertainment other than saloons, gambling houses, and honky-tonks for 1895, or they would lose the bid for the site to a competitively alert Lincoln, like that. Gordon Wattles, who was a banker in Omaha, who had moved from Iowa, began to solicit funds to stage a really big fair to answer all these questions in Omaha. He also established something called Ak-Sar-Ben, which was Nebraska spelled backwards. Ak-Sar-Ben as an organization still exists. They don't have the flamboyant shows and things that they used to have, or parades, but they still exist today. So we're going to have an interesting new twist, because we're going to have a year without a state fair. They got together $90,000 in donations, which is a princely amount of money at that time. They convinced the city of Omaha to install street lights for the purpose of the fair. They also installed, or got, the Omaha Street Railway system to lay down a double track to the fairgrounds, and the Missouri Pacific Railroad to actually lay a railroad track to the fairgrounds. Then they sold stock in the fair to businessmen in Omaha in order to finance it. The result was the biggest state fair ever. 1894. we have what is called the TransMississippi Congress established, and all the governors of the states west of the Mississippi and most of the mayors of larger cities got involved in this. A fair suggested by William Jennings Bryan. This would be sort of to answer the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. He thought we should have another World's Fair much like that. Unfortunately, what he didn't figure on was there was a panic, a nationwide panic in 1893, more or less a minor depression. However, even with the lingering of the 1893 depression, the United States Senate gave $200,000 to the proposition, and then another $40,000 if the fair would sponsor at the same time a Congress of American Indians, and an encampment, if you will. State of Nebraska legislature set aside $100,000. Douglas County set aside $100,000. Omaha itself gave $30,000. All the other states west of the Mississippi River gave a total of $138,000, and 6,000 stockholders contributed $500,000. So suddenly we've got a princely amount of money for a fair. It will be held 1898 from June clear through November. And in order to do that, we're going to, wrong button, actually construct buildings. It's going to be known as the TransMississippi Exposition. Herbert Kuntz, who was a banker and large real estate owner in Omaha, donated for the use of the fair. In other words, it will be donated only during that time period. 10 acres of land at what he called Kuntz Park, which was a suburb or addition to the city of Omaha, which he owned, which had no buildings on it. It had been up to that time a cornfield, then it had been a racetrack, then it was briefly the Douglas County Fairgrounds. And I've shown a couple of the buildings already. This is an overview. There we go, an overview of the fairgrounds. And you can see it was a very elaborate, with the amount of money it had, to develop undeveloped land in a few months in order to build this spectacular fairgrounds, for lack of a better word. The streetcars ran from downtown Omaha to the fairgrounds on 4 separate lines. 6 Midwestern cities had already attempted fairs after Chicago, but Omaha is the one that's really going to survive. Lots of things were planned that didn't come about. A copper mine was going to be put there. Interestingly, there were 2 Omaha madams, and I have to sort of stop and think, what do we want to call them? Minna and Ada Everly. They doubled their investment in the fair because they were sure it was going to be good for their business as well, and I think it probably turned out all right. This is actually one of the many hundreds of photographs that were taken mostly by a man by the name of Reinhardt of the fair, published in postcards, published as books, and so forth with this 1898 fair. Then, by stuffing the ballot box, a bunch of taxi drivers got together and nominated the Queen of the Exposition, which was actually yet another prostitute. So things were political then, just as they are now. An amazing thing. The general architect for the fair was Thomas Kimball, and a man from Boston who I did not know, C. Howard Walker, a prominent architect I did not know. All of the buildings in the fairgrounds were designed according to very specific standards, all in harmony with each other. All were to be primarily ivory white with gray and green roofs. They called it an eclectic composite of Renaissance design, heavily laden with romantic concepts, and it is indeed. Each building had its own dominant theme. Each one was to have a central pavilion and then subordinate pavilions around it. Most of these buildings were constructed not of what looks to be like a white stone, but actually what's called staff. This is a photograph of an exhibit which showed what staff is. Think of it as a few layers of plaster over lath, more or less. This composite included horsehair and things to hold it together, but it was not designed to last more than really roughly a year because it would not weather very well at all. The official part of the fairgrounds covered 180 acres of land, plus an additional 70 square blocks of land, ran in general, if you know Omaha at all, from 16th to 24th Street, from Pinckney to Pratt Streets, very large. The main court, which I showed a minute ago, and here's another picture of the main court, was a half a mile long and featured a lagoon. There were 37 major buildings in the fairgrounds and scores, if not hundreds, of tiny buildings as well. The fair itself took 13 months to completely build, so it went up in a hurry, and it's going to come down pretty quickly too. Staff, as I mentioned before, was a mixture primarily of cement and plaster of Paris and horsehair. So it wasn't exactly too sturdy. This is an aerial view, or excuse me, a view at night. The place was lit with electricity, and they had their own electrical generating plant. And one of their thoughts was, in building this electrical generating plant, that they would later turn it over to the city of Omaha, and it would generate electricity for the city of Omaha. As far as I can determine, this probably never happened. I can't be sure. 40 states brought exhibits or had buildings at the fair, and 10 foreign countries. Electricity, this is the first time a major fair had ever been lit by electricity. It was opened electrically by the president from Washington, D.C. on June the 1st of 1898. Lots of buildings. This is the Wisconsin building. Some of them were more elaborate than others. All of them looked to be elaborate. Some of them inside were not as elaborate as they were on the outside. On May the 22nd, 2 women from the Salvation Army scaled the walls and destroyed a couple of female pieces of artwork because they were showing their breasts. Lieutenant Dorothy Meyer and Ensign McCormick hacked up 2 statues. It wouldn't have been hard to do because the statues as well were mostly made out of plaster of Paris. Cupid and Apollo were their names, and it gave the fair great publicity. They did not exactly create what they wanted to. In addition, there were also a 2,500 seat auditorium in the States building. We've seen the Wisconsin building. I think we're going to have pictures of the Nebraska building in a minute. The landscape architect was Rudolph Ulrich, and he sat trees around, as you can see in this one, 250,000 palm, orange, and so forth trees were planted around the fairgrounds. In addition to those 30,000, the fair was lit by 30,000 light bulbs and 45,000 light bulbs outside that court or main lagoon area, which we saw. The building we see here is the horticulture building. This would be the machinery building, and you can see again the lagoon in front. This is the electricity building. Agriculture building, which was one of the largest, was 400 feet by 150 feet, very tall, and its main entrance, Bob and Matt probably knows this, but I did not know the term hemicycle, which I guess is what that is. I had never run across it before. The building was considered in total free Renaissance, with corn, wheat, garlands, and cornucopias as capitals. One frieze, which is not clearly visible here, is a strutting turkey with outspread tail. The color was ivory, accentuated by this colored photograph, by the way, in yellow, purple, red, and green. It just as well be in color to me, but none of the photographs were actually. Statuary around the building represented various things, the zodiac, favorable winds, the seasons, and so forth and so on. The architect in this was Cass Gilbert, who we have heard of St. Paul, who was at that point in time the president of the AIA. Fine Arts Building. And this is a building being built. I think it is the Nebraska building under construction. Or is it the government building? I get a little confused. This may be the government building. Says, yeah, because it has the dome or the Statue of Liberty enlightening the world above just below the cupola there. with her torch is 178 feet above grade. A map of the fairgrounds in general. This is the streets of Cairo, which is it's sort of like the Midway, if you will, of the fair. Also called the Midway Plaisance, which is, I take it, a French word. The person who named it that got a $10 prize, though, so good for them. Within here, there is an ostrich farm, a 150-foot observation tower, a submarine which ran down the gondola tracks in the lagoon. They brought Jesse James home up from Missouri as just something to see. Little Egypt performed in this area. Turned out to be Little Egypt was an Omaha girl, but she was advertised as having alluring sinuosities. Heaven knows exactly what those were. They also proposed a lot of things which didn't get built. An elevated bicycle route around the whole thing, 14 above the grade. A 1,000-foot ski jump to cost no less than $80,000. They didn't get made, so we don't know for sure what was involved in those. There was also an elevator which took people down to a subterranean area, the terrors of Hades, which was just actually slightly below grade, but it rattled and shook and it made you think you were going down along. There was also an Indian encampment, which was primarily brought along because they got the money from the federal government. The receipts from the Midway alone totaled $276,112, and most of these rides were a nickel and a dime, so you can imagine it took an awful lot of them to do it. This is the giant, I guess we call it a seesaw. There's also a Chinese village. The Chinese village used 328 Chinese people who they brought from China for the exhibit, partly as workers, partly as performers. The U.S. Immigration Department watched these Chinese folks like crazy. Literally tried to keep one person on each person. They knew where every 328 of them were. After the fair was over, all 328 disappeared into Omaha. Not a one of them went back to China. Interesting. Another view just of the general area of the streets of Cairo. The Midway itself covered an additional 40 acres, that giant seesaw which we saw a minute ago. There were several marriages performed in those cars. Great success. What else? Going backwards. No wonder it doesn't make any sense at all there. We don't go forwards. We don't know what's coming up next. On April 11th of 1898, when this picture was taken, literally, that was the day the United States declared war on Spain, Spanish-American War. It didn't last very long. It lasted only until October the 12th. And I said this is the date of the picture was when the war is declared. It is not. It is the date when, after the war, October, when President McKinley and his cabinet, most of it, arrived in Omaha. And that day, when this picture was taken, the attendance at the fair, 98,845 people. This is called McKinley Day for obvious reasons. The fair is going to close in October of 1898. They considered it a tremendous success. 90% of the stockholders' money was returned to them. They figured on getting none of it back. They figured it was a gift, so they got a tremendous asset when they got back. 2.6 million people attended the fair that year, a little less than 5 months. 2,613,000 if you're really interested. It cost 50 cents to get in if you were an adult and 25 cents if you were a child. There was talk, and they did extend the fair slightly. Another group came in, but nonetheless, November the 4th of 1898, the Kansas and Iowa buildings were raised. And they charged 15 cents to go in and watch the tearing down of the building. So they made money coming and made money going. New York Pavilions was converted to a double dwelling. The Nebraska building was converted to state property, which used it for a warehouse. Wisconsin's building was moved to Los Angeles for an exposition there. Supposedly, the Minnesota building was moved to Council Bluffs and used as a roadhouse, but this is probably not so. It was a rumor, more or less. The building which ended up there may have been made from logs from the building, and it still stands, by the way, near Council Bluffs, but we don't think, in fact, it was the building at all now. A couple of things ended up at the Lawrenson Gardens, a gazebo, a couple of small things one of them ended up at Syndicate Park, which is on the site of what's today the Omaha Henry Doorly Zoo. It did not survive much long after that. That was the Boys and Girls Building. So almost nothing is left of the fair. But this canceled the 1899 fair. The 1898 exposition was considered to be the state fair that year, but I don't think the state got any publicity or any money from it at all. And Exarban came upon at that time, and they just decided, then Omaha just walked away from their contract for the state fair. They were going to use Exarban as their fundraising fair from that point onward. So there was no state fair per se in 1898, and because Omaha simply walked away from the concept in 1899, even though they had the contract for it, there was no state fair in 1899. Lots and lots of pieces of the fair were buried in the lagoon, which was just covered over and became Kuntz Park. And here, some years ago, they excavated that lagoon part of it and got hundreds of bits and pieces. But you can imagine something made out of plaster that's buried underground for any period of time. It didn't survive very well at all. This is the Minnesota building, which supposedly got moved, but in fact, we think this is the building which is said to be the Minnesota Pavilion after it was moved near Council Bluffs. But there really seems to be no indication that it is the same building unless there were logs used from it. And there are great reports of that building coming down the river in rafts and so forth. But as near as we can tell, all of them were just articles of fancy. It didn't really happen at all. Some of the buildings were bought by two guys in Omaha, Eiler and Hayden. The grounds were temporarily improved, and they had a brief exposition in there the following year called the Greater American Exposition, which celebrated the fact that the United States at that point in time had colonies. They reopened briefly for a few months and got, the first day, 15,000 people came, so it wasn't a total bust. And in fact, it ran only until November of 1899, and supposedly over 800,000 people did visit the fair. But remember, it's not the state fair at all. The lagoon was briefly used for ice skating before it just simply pushed all the rest of the buildings into it. It became Kuntz Park today, if you go to Omaha and look for it. This is an overall view, again, of the lagoon. Now, we're going to enter into the next phase, which is going to be someone who you know, but you don't recognize from this picture, Charles Gear. He and a man by the name of McFarland championed moving the state fair to the city of Lincoln, and in 1899, they will purchase the Lancaster County Fairgrounds for $35,000. They made a provision that from this point onward, that the state fair will forever be held no further than 3 miles from the state capitol building. That worked quite a while. Not forever. But with no fair in 1898, the board got a $4,000 appropriation to pay off debts from the fair. Really wasn't much. Then Lincoln businessmen contributed $3,000 to repair the county buildings here. The tents are on the building. 1888, the fair in Lincoln. One year, they moved a lot of the exhibits downtown. This is O Street, as is obvious, right? We're standing roughly at 13th Street, looking kind of up O Street towards the west, to the upper right-hand side of the picture. So pretty much they moved a lot of the eateries and some of the exhibits to O Street. Also, we managed to get one of the aeroplanes from the Wright Brothers. There are a couple of slides of the, or a couple of pictures. This is only one I know of. It's easy to get. It's a postcard. The State Fair, probably 1909. And this is early on because the first flight at Kitty Hawk was 1903. So the Wright Brothers came. We also had horse races. 1910 attendance was 99,000 and odd. However, during the first year, horse races within a half mile of the fair were still illegal. Then in the 1890s, we'll build the first grandstand we see here. It says it seated 125,000 people, or excuse me, 12,500 people. Probably could have. 1904, and I have no reason to think this is Dan Patch, but Dan Patch did race at the fair in 1904. Then in 1929, they built a new grandstand. They also, at this point in time, had their first automobile races. Pretty sporty looking cars there. The new 1929 grandstand cost $250,000. Then we will have the third generation grandstand in 1977. Some of you can probably remember the old Fairgrounds Entrance. Originally, the fair was at 17th and Fair Streets, and if you've ever driven over that part of Lincoln and wondered why there was a Fair Street, which doesn't seem to go anyplace, the original entrance to the fair was at 17th and Fair Streets. These gates were at 17th and Clinton, which were built probably in 1924. We always have great contention about what was built at the fairgrounds. They didn't seem to keep great records. These were torn down in 1950. Agriculture building. Let's see, okay, 1927, the first fair in the United States, it was, excuse me, let me rephrase that. It was the first, or the number one fair in the United States in per capita attendance in 1927. It also in 1927 was the first state fair in the United States to charge an admission fee. And in 1927, they were the third fair in terms of numbers, in terms of daily attendance. So our state fair was very, very well attended in its early days. Octagon building, they also ran a trolley car to the exhibit. This is the Kinder Nook, which is sort of like a daycare or kindergarten. In 1876, the Burlington laid tracks to the fairgrounds. They ran a train every day at 1:30. It returned to the city at 5 o'clock. This is not a trolley car. This is actually a train. 1884, the trolley car, or the street railway, carried 110,000 people in 1 week. 1894, sounds like a good number. 1895, Lincoln Street Railway was bankrupt. Didn't go well for them. 1910, the Burlington and Lincoln Traction Company offered 2-minute rides to the fairgrounds quite frequently. This is the Midway, or the amusement court. Hard to say. 1924, that's dated, but it could be slightly before that. We don't have a good date on it. Entrance to the Midway, and we're looking down towards the grandstand, so that would be pretty much looking towards the northeast. This would be looking pretty much towards the northwest and a boulevard. Of course, we can't go out there now and find exactly where hardly any of this is. Maybe you could lay it out on a map and figure it out, but it's pretty hard to tell. The Midway was very, very popular, of course, drew a lot of people. This is the construction of the 1913 agriculture building, which is going to be one of the buildings which sort of still exists on the fairgrounds. Interior of that building. 1913 this was taken. Also this one, 1913 probably. And another interior view. This is the building which they're going to build kind of around. an aerial view of it. It was rather a clever building with skylights and buildings all around it. Its walls, some of them still exist. I really don't know how much of the building they saved, and why, I'm not sure either. The building to the left is probably the 4H building, which also still stands, and that's connected to several other buildings that are still extant at this point in time. This is the exterior of that building, which still stands. It's got sort of walls built around it, and it stands, but it's no more than a shell. This is the Coliseum. This is the trolley stop, of which there were a couple, or you could get the streetcar back to Lincoln. This is a later kinder building, if you will. I think this is the 4-H building. And of course they had the open air theater. This is Larry Price, as a matter of fact, is in this picture. Jim Arnett is the other guy, and I can't be sure. I think it's Larry on the left, but I'm absolutely not positive. I'm going to have to find out. Larry Price was born in Ray, Colorado in 1916. When he was 13 years old, he sold vegetables from a cart, which he got the vegetables from his mother's garden, and took them around and sold them to neighbors at age 13. Then at age 17, in 1934, Larry went and decided he was going to have a food booth at the state fair. He went in to apply for a concession and found out that all of the concessions that year had already been sold. So he turned around, and as he was leaving the building, another gentleman was coming into the building. And it's a good thing he hesitated, because the man coming in said, "I'm not going to be able to take my booth this year." And he turned it back. So at age 17, Larry Price borrowed a kerosene stove and a cookie sheet and a spatula from his mother, on which he cooked the first hamburgers. And the topper was what he called it at that time, because his hamburgers, he said, could not be topped. He fried every hamburger himself, wouldn't let anybody else do it. And in order to ensure that that happened, he took the spatula with him whenever he left. If he went to the restroom, he took the spatula with him. He said the secret to his success from the very first day was he used lots of pepper and very good meat. Unfortunately, it was a very tough time, because everyone that came to the fair was used to bringing their own lunch with them, so he wasn't successful right away. The first few years were rather lame. That first year, well, everything was a nickel and a dime, and then by 1944 he increased his prices. Hamburgers were 20 cents and sodas were 10 cents, two-price system. 1954, hamburgers went to 30 cents. Well, the rest, of course, becomes, this is what it looked like towards the last part. He went to Bethany and opened the first King's restaurant there in Bethany. And at its height, he had 160 King's restaurants in the United States and Canada. And of course, the building behind me is still there, but the King's is gone. Aerial view of the fair. Right at the front of the Fairgrounds entrance, and I'm not sure, Matt, whether you knew Lee Erie, or Lee Irie as he was sometimes known. He was a great member of the Coin Club, the reason I thought you might know him, but he had a stand right there at the front where he sold food, and his father later had a restaurant downtown, as did Lee. This is the new Fairgrounds entrance. New grandstand. Then, in 1965, the concessions for the rides was owned by a man by the name of W.T. Collins, the Collins Show. The Sky Ride we see here, this is the first time he had used it. That was 550 feet long, 30 feet off the ground, and had 30 gondola cars. And then on Sunday, September 5, 1965, two of the towers collapsed, and two people were actually killed when the thing fell down. I was at the fair that day. We had a booth where we were selling a new book which we had just published, the Nebraska Centennial's First Lady's Cookbook. So I was there every day. And I stayed in the grandstand. I did not come out because they literally kept everybody inside while they tried to clear it. The fair got a great freshening about that point in time in the 70s. Part of this was designed by Bailey Lewis, Bailey Lowerman Advertising. Then they began bringing in other buildings. This is a school building which they brought in called the Heritage Village, which was started in the 1970s. Inside they actually had classrooms during the school year. The building had been built in 1930. The Fair Board paid $900 for it and moved it from Saunders County in. They also brought in the Cheney, Nebraska Depot. Looks a little forlorn here. The other building that they had temporarily out there was the Hudson Cabin. And during the school year, school children would attend, I forget whether it was a week or two, and ultimately 25,000 students from Lincoln Public School attended a week or two of classes out here during the year. This is what's left of the interior at that time of the Agricultural Arts Building, the interior of the open air auditorium, radio stations, everyday broadcast from the fair. This is the building which was also the house which, through Henry Brandt, the director, they lived in during the summer out there. I presume, Clay, you'll be moving to Grand Island during the fair and have adequate housing like this. Actually, after Henry Brandt was the director of the fair, I think Mr. Skold was the next director, and I don't think any of the directors lived in the building after that. One of the buildings which survived would be the 4-H building, which looked like this inside. And believe me, it looks nothing like that today, but it does still survive. Another interesting building which survived a long time, but is no longer out there now, of course, 4-H building, was built originally in 1931 and was, by the time the State Fair was closed in Lincoln, it really had begun to deteriorate very, very badly. And I appeared before a committee at the Capitol building, the legislature, and pointed out that all of the electrical in the building at that point in time was still the 1931 electrical, and did get an appropriations from the legislature at that time to do that over again. They estimated in 2007 that it would cost $4.5 million to bring the building up to grade. This little building is the Normal Nebraska State Bank. And this building stood on South Street, right on the northwest corner of 56th and South. And I remember it as a soft serve ice cream store. It was a film developing shop. And it, during its life there, it got turned 45 degrees, but originally it faced South Street. And Sam Miller, the physician, had his office, his medical office, right next door in the old grocery store building to the west. And that's where Roland Ludke, mayor of the city of Lincoln, worked as a young man in that building. And talking to Sam Miller one day, he told me about the day that the Normal State Bank was robbed. And the man who robbed it came in and went in the front door. There was only one person there, and that was the president of the bank. And he said, well, he wanted to know who could open the vault. And the guy said, well, you know, I can open the vault, but it's on a time clock, and I can't open it now. So he kidnapped him and took him out to a field near Normal, Nebraska, and was going to hold him until the secretary arrived to open the vault. But guess what? He finally thought, this isn't worth it. They let the guy go. So the bank was never robbed, but after it served all those little retail businesses, and before they built that new little 2-story kind of a concrete block building on that corner, the State Fair got the building. They moved it out, and it became just storage right on the creek on the west edge of the building. So it lasted from the early days in Normal, Nebraska, and then just disappeared. Here we see the first buildings in Grand Island, which I presume are all still there on the Forner Park area. Later on, this is looking towards the west. We can see the new building that will be the old agriculture hall. And as I said, it is changed so much that there's really not much left of it except that exterior wall. The Devaney Center you can see there looking off towards the west. And this would be the last slide. An interesting picture of Grand Island, probably in about 1913, something like that, in which they have not only moved the State Fair to Grand Island, but in this picture, they've moved the second Capitol building to Grand Island. You can see it standing there in the background. I wasn't sure how long it was going to take. I didn't know whether we were going to be ending up with 2 programs out of 1, but this is our last slide. So if there are any questions, this would be the time I would entertain them. And maybe I have answered every single question about the Territorial Fair, Axarban, TransMississippi Exposition, and the Nebraska State Fair, which now is more than 3 miles from the Capitol building. And people have asked me always, or even before it moved, what I thought. Should it move or should it not move? And I always felt the State Fair should be closer to the center of Nebraska and closer to agriculture and the real reason the State Fair existed from the beginning. The only thing I don't know whether they've ever done that I suggested at that time is that they had another kind of a fair for agricultural use in Grand Island later or earlier in the year, and I suggested that they be combined. I don't know that that's ever happened, or they still have those 2 separate, okay, yeah, 2 separate entities, yeah. If not, we stand, yeah, question?
When did the old Coliseum get torn down?
I do not know the answer to when the old Coliseum was torn down. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
I always have
It was there.
memory that it was in the 60s, and I
Well,
thought I saw the circus there, but
It's
might have been
possible. In fact, it had to be in the probably the mid or late 60s, because I took my daughter, who was born in, no, it'd have to be in the 70s actually, because my daughter was born in 69, and I took her to the fair out there. It would have been in the early 70s. A shrine circus, as I recall it. So it came down, the auditorium you're talking about, not the grandstand.
yeah.
Yeah, the auditorium came down at that time. The grandstand lasted quite a bit longer. But I am not sure what date the auditorium was turned down, and I see no one out there helping me with an answer either. Sorry. Okay, well, thank you very much, and the next time we meet, we will be back completely in the city of Lincoln again, and we will be definitely within 3 miles of the state capitol building. Okay. Thank you.